So this is how democracy dies with a cool-based dictator. Hello everyone, I hope you're all well today. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about news from El Salvador because it seems that Bukele might be around for the foreseeable future, really, and from our point of view, there's certainly nothing to complain about there, is there? It seems like he's doing, not only is he doing a magnificent job practically, just in terms of the day-to-day work of making El Salvador a safer country. But the thing that's also really impressive about Bukele is he offers the intellectual moral foundations to really go against the international rules-based order, right? The world of the human rights lawyers, the United Nations, and all these NGOs that are so often responsible for the destabilizing, rotting nature that a lot of the Western countries in the world have fallen into, of course, our own included in that. So let's talk about it a little bit. It says, after slashing term limits and reshaping elections, Bukele tightens his grip on El Salvador, drawing on widespread support earned through anti-gang crackdowns, while the critics warn that dismantling the democratic safeguards risks sliding the country towards authoritarian rule. So the first thing to say about this is, as it goes on to say there, what they're first in the first road to anti-democracy is moving an election closer. So rather than running for re-election in the middle of 2029, what's actually going to happen is that the election is going to be in 2027, so 2 years' time. But there has also been the vote that has been held with a massive majority within the government to 57-3 in order to basically do away with term limits. Now, this is an enormous threat to the rules-based order, because obviously one of the things that is so much a staple of our political systems is the kayfabe, that you obviously have with the Democrats and the Republicans, Labour and the Tories, and the fact that you are given this constant illusion of choice. But at the same time, for all of the apparent choice that we have in our democratic system, the gulf of difference between what the people want to happen and what our leaders are actually prepared to do is, of course, so vast and so broad and so perverted that what we have across the West, particularly in Europe, is, of course, mass dissatisfaction and a genuine populist revolt against the system as it is, right? This is why all these populist parties keep getting continually voted for, because people are looking outside of the traditional parties to save them. Now, obviously, as we know, a lot of these populist parties, such as the one that Maloney has, come with a lot of tough rhetoric and then constantly disappoint turn after turn. But unlike Maloney, Bukele has seemingly done a lot of good for El Salvador. We have demonstrative proof of his credentials as a statesman, as a leader, and as someone who is willing to stand up for all of the people in El Salvador that the human rights lawyers didn't actually care about, right? They weren't concerned about the human rights of all of the victims of the gangs that plagued El Salvador for years and years, some of the most monstrous and barbarous gangs that, well, anywhere in the world, frankly. But you go on to see this article talking about, just seething at the fact that this has been allowed to happen. It says, opponents now say the Lotus constitutional overhaul marks another step away from democracy and towards indefinite rule. Unlimited re-election brings a consolidation of power. Nepotism rises, corruption rises, political participation is frozen. But I've never really heard of a dictatorship that relies upon constant re-election, right? And this is truly what they fear, because if Bukele can create a system that is safe, prosperous, has harmony, empowers genuine justice for those in society who actually deserve it, then it proves and sets an example for the rest of the West going forward for an entire parasitic organism of human rights lawyers and all these sorts of people who are just leeching on and defending the worst people in society, people who did not give a second thought to the human rights of their own victims, who in many cases they've butchered, mutilated, as can be seen in the clip that I'm going to play in a minute. So if Bukele is able to do this, then it presents an existential threat to those systems throughout the West. But one of the other things that it marks as well is you can see a lot of the pressure and fear from those NGOs and human rights organizations that I speak about here. As you can see, United Nations experts are demanding the protection for Ruth Lopez after her enforced disappearance. So it sounds from what I was reading that she was arrested a few months ago and she was a human rights lawyer. The UN spokespeople go on to say, the state authorities who detain individuals and refuse to acknowledge that they are in custody or disclose their fate or whereabouts place them outside the protection of the law. Such acts constitute an enforced disappearance. And they go on to say the enforced disappearance of human rights defenders is a strategy often used to spread terror. It creates a chilling effect in society, deterring individuals from taking action to protect the public interest out of fear. A chilling effect on your society, perhaps. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this case, and for all I know, well, I don't know what the fate of this woman is at the moment. Obviously, I presume if Bukele is willing to merely imprison the most monstrous criminals in his society, then a worse fate, logically, hasn't befallen this woman either. But what I want to focus on here is the people that the globalist order is trying to defend. You see here them coming to the protection of their friends, and Bukele has clearly set himself up in opposition to them because, as he lays out here in a very, very good speech that I won't play because he's speaking in Spanish, of course, he goes on to detail the fact that the entire moral system of the human rights order is inherently flawed because it weighs up the rights of the criminals and puts them above the rights of the victims. And my God, as someone living in Britain right now, doesn't that just seem to be the case every single waking day? That we're around here. Always the human rights legislation values the illegal migrant, the foreign rapist, and never the actual victims themselves. It's truly, truly barbaric, and you can see the dissatisfaction with this moral system and the fact that what it does is it promotes injustice everywhere it goes. And so there's no surprise, really, that Bukele is becoming something of a moral authority in his own country, and by his example, a thought leader throughout the West as well. Because it's really not about democracy or tyranny or any such thing. It's about, is this leader, is power responding to the problems and concerns that the public at large face? And of course, Bukele came to power on a on a torrent of public sentiment that was really just all based on making El Salvador a safe place to live in again. And when people get that desperate for their children to walk the streets safely, for their parents not to be hacked up in front of their eyes by barbarous gangs, at some point you stop caring about what the Constitution demands and you just care about having a Carlylean great man of history come in and address the problems head on. And the more that the human rights organizations set themselves up in opposition to this, and what's more, seek to whose movements will encourage things to backslide into a state where the criminal sect will have domination over society again, when the human rights organizations are setting themselves up in protection of those people, well, we can't really be surprised when you have many, many outlets that are worried that Bukele is going to find himself elected and re-elected again and again for all time. Because, let's face it, who would we rather have? A great man of history who's willing to defend the common good like Bukele, or a human rights lawyer like Keir Starmer?